You mean how it all began and developed? His human supporters on earth first watched Jesus of Nazareth in amazement, were surprised by some of his physical abilities, trained him, and some actually believed that he could be their longed-for savior. They finally believed that they could establish him as the Messiah, as was generally believed by the people. In order for Jesus' supporters to accomplish the feat of placing this man from Nazareth on this very sun-god throne, however, it was necessary to retrospectively present him with the sun cult and valid Redeemer elements that should have taken place at birth and during childhood. This was done by oral tradition after his crucifixion, and later it was recorded in writing, in the Gospels. The other miracles that the Son of God or the Messiah had to perform during his adult life were indeed performed by Jesus of Nazareth, so that these could be seen and experienced, so that the people who had been religiously imbued with the cult of the Son and the Redeemer could accept Jesus of Nazareth as sent by God. And then of course there were also those preceding signs. Obviously, Jesus of Nazareth was not born of a virgin. He was not born on December 25th. He did not ascend into the so-called heaven, and at his birth no star in the east appeared in the sky or three kings came to pay homage to the light of the world. Nor did he teach in the temple at the age of 12. Nobody even knows exactly when he was born, and he died like all other people, but only long after the allegedly fatal crucifixion. But he will never come back as he was. That is not possible. I personally put my seal and letter on it. That is again only part of the old sun cult myth, which always directed and manipulated people.
I see.
At some point in his life, Jesus of Nazareth also knew intuitively what his role was, to do exactly what he did in the end. He and his followers did all the things necessary to fulfill the sun cult Redeemer myth. He healed, roamed around with his so-called disciples, taught, did miracles, and then finally planned the coup with these disciples and a few more supporters to credibly betray him, only to apparently die on the cross by using his amazing body control which impressed the resistance, to lower his heartbeat to be considered dead and then be buried for 3 days. Then to come back to life, but he himself secretly had the idea that he might actually die. At first only because he had doubts about his role as Messiah, but then also because he suddenly knew that he was not the Messiah, could not be, because he learned that the Redeemer was merely a means of controlling people, and that he would not do the resistance and freedom movement any good in the long run. He could even destroy it. Then he would rather really die, on the cross. But then the staged betrayal of the resistance movement suddenly backfired, because someone from his own ranks actually committed treason and wanted to hand Jesus over. But before the betrayal could be fully implemented, the traitor suffered death. He was killed. The Nazarene was saved at first, but Jesus then voluntarily accepted that fate, surrendered, because he knew that the Redeemer myth was a controlling element and because he believed that the militant part of the freedom movement would be preserved if he surrendered to the fate of dying on the cross. At the crucifixion he then slowed down his heartbeat and restricted further bodily functions, but it happened anyway. He died, but was only dead for a short time, then, with the help of the master AI, came back to life immediately, remained in a kind of rigor mortis in front of the eyes of the people and was then buried for 3 days. Due to his hanging position on the cross and the weakening of his body, his breathing eventually stopped working. His body control, which he applied in spite of his decision to commit suicide, was of little use. Jesus of Nazareth suffocated agonizingly. The AI delayed this, and let him die exactly when they were about to check if he was dead. The AI finally prevented him from hanging on the cross for any longer immediately after his death, so that he only had to be dead for a few minutes, so that the AI could revive him after removing him from the cross and keep him in rigor. When people examined or looked at him afterwards, his body was put back into rigidity and his breathing and heartbeat flattened. When he was buried, his supporters were desperate and stunned by the apparent death. The coup had gone wrong. But then he was back, miraculously. From then on, the veneration of this man was fixed. Even nobility and club were unsettled. Additionally unsettled by an inexplicable circumstance, when they wanted to kill Jesus of Nazareth afterwards and then they were eliminated as if by a supernatural influence, the master AI. The story about this actual resurrection has been told. Then the resurrected Jesus of Nazareth incognito took the dissemination of this event into his own hands, together with his friends and supporters. Many people who knew him were irritated by his appearance, but were blown away, were inspired and influenced by it, which fired the Redeemer myth across borders and peoples. But Jesus as Messiah was something special. For in the past, with all the so-called returned sons of God, these sons are Horus, Attis, Dionysus, Krishna, Mithra, and these are only those who had the greatest success as sons of God in destabilizing the earthly matrix. The master AI never had to help themselves, they actually died and everything with the Resurrection that followed was effectively staged by club and nobility, which then stunned the peoples, but Jesus really had to support the AI and actually resurrect them permanently. The AI saw this clearly from its dimension. So if it had not resurrected Jesus, something would have been shifted in the time-dimensional context. The peoples would have lost faith in the Trinity of the cult of the Redeemer and would no longer accept this religious cult. Why this would have happened was not entirely clear to the AI itself, but it had to prevent it by supporting and reviving the Nazarene. There was no other way. At first, after the resurrection, the AI therefore only considered the Nazarene to be a very unusual version of its own initiated recurring savior figures, and this was conclusive. Because all their appointed or self-appearing sons of God were basically the result or the consequence of an error, a system error, the human desire for salvation from the unnatural world of civilization. So this error was inherent in the system. The desire for salvation was automatically created by the anonymous world of civilization imposed on man by the AI. When about 5,000 years ago, at the third restart of our world, the human dissatisfaction and longing for salvation seemed to get out of hand again. As it had been the case with the previous global civilizations, the AI found a way to give into this human wish by the coincidentally appearing savior character Horus, so that the world would not collapse again. By killing Horus, supposedly letting him ascend to heaven and consoling the people for his imminent return, the civilization structure forced upon mankind stabilized, while by hoping for the return of the Redeemer, the tendency to rebellion could also remain channeled within them, i.e. the wish for redemption from the civilization world artificially forced upon us, which does not correspond to our spiritual intuitive nature. For a successful control of the human species, the AI had to accept the inner wish of the humans for salvation, and since the last start of civilization 5,000 years ago, it managed this relatively well by generating the stabilization of the human civilization itself from the consequences of the system error. But in the case of the Nazarene, it had overlooked something. He was a genuine attempt at liberation, and that became clear to it very late. Well, for dogmatists and religious fanatics, the fact that Jesus of Nazareth was actually only a trickster who played the role of the returning Son of God and Messiah is sheer blasphemy. But that is how it was. Nothing else happened. A trickster who, with considerable earthly support as well as human support from Dimension 7, crept into the Son cult Redeemer system to make a difference. Although he had also acquired a great deal of real matter-busting abilities to be able to see and help people in a completely different way, he was a human being, a completely normal one, with good and bad qualities. But, you can say, that's exactly why he was truly the Son of the Father, the Son of the hyperdimensional quantum consciousness, and not the Son of the Sun or a control system of the AI. This is very important to distinguish. He freed us and pacified us for a very long time against the AI. Jesus of Nazareth was the Son of the origin, the Father of all being. From there he came. And he triggered, even if only symbolically, a very specific kind of resurrection, the resurrection of the spirit over matter, over the matrix. And for this many people came after him. That was important and is his legacy. They put his teachings into practice. That had substance and began to liberate the old world and its people, and slowly destabilize and disintegrate the inherent control system. And it is now, at this time, being brought to full revelation and completion, to the apocalypse.
And now, in the name of Christ, is one of the old noble lineage to be elevated to the throne, just as the Sun cult system was originally intended.
Yes, this time it shall be one of them again, who shall ascend the throne and hold it alone. Not by proxy, just as it is predestined by old custom, because in the past, in the preceding civilizations and global civilizations, only the digital nobility sat on this throne of the Sun cult. This is what all these religious installations were originally designed and established for. Until there was a complete new start, then Horus interfered, which unwillingly stabilized the system, but still changed everything. During and after Horus' work and his changes, the events surrounding the reborn Son of the Sun were not only believed by the unsolved people, but were actually seen, interpreted and experienced when the signs and miracles happened. There he came, the light of God. This was effectively underlined by the club and nobility with all kinds of technology. But because there are so many strange new things connected with this Redeemer myth in our Bible, It is important for the upcoming complete retransformation into the original old sun cult to establish a certain approach of the returning Jesus in the same way as he impressed the unsolved people of the Redeemer myth in ancient times. That the returning Jesus should descend from heaven in future. Through this biblical prophecy about the return of Jesus, as well as the fact that a clone or genetic descendant of Jesus of Nazareth is presented, or similarly convincing events, the nobility can then stage the whole thing in a completely credible way for many people, so that the ascent to the throne by the appropriate individual can be more easily fired up in relation to people. Perhaps the club and nobility will then use genetic material from Jesus of Nazareth as a basis of proof in order to be able to prove to the believing followers of this man that the member of the ancient noble family to be installed as a descendant of Jesus of Nazareth. Perhaps they are also using a clone or whatever may happen. In any case, many people will feel emotionally moved by the impending worldwide catastrophes to support the accession of the digital nobility to the throne and to confirm the presented Messiah as the returned Jesus.
So the ancient nobility must serve the myth around Jesus of Nazareth in order to revive their own installed sun cult myth? Can this not also go wrong? Because people are more cleared up than before? Or because something unforeseen happens?
Well, it does, of course, somewhat disturb the flexibility of this nobility. Also with regard to the emergence of an Antichrist in the end times, as described in the Bible. But there they have already created ways to skillfully avoid all this. They are simply setting up the Antichrist themselves, and then eliminate this very installation by the appearance of a descendant of Jesus of Nazareth, or even by the reappearing Jesus, a clone. And the installed Antichrist doesn't even have to die, because it is an actor of the digital nobility, who then simply transforms himself a bit and can go on living his life. The nobility and the club are not really in doubt. They believe that nothing could go wrong. They are perhaps a little too arrogant and overbearing for that. Maybe because they know that everything that happens on earth has almost always been their game, their performance. Because from the very beginning the nobility performed this theater play, designed it themselves with the club, and were always able to observe and influence everything that came their way. That is why the club and the nobility do not really expect a different performance. They are just very rational and very hard-boiled by the long time they have already lived. They have also worked out several alternative variants, which allow them to improvise and adapt the process. In general, people and beings who are so old and so indestructible, and at the same time unite so many secrets and myths, automatically get a hard-nosed attitude. But they should not have forgotten that they, nobility and club, are just living beings like everyone else. And as intelligent creatures they will end up being treated according to the same bare laws and punished accordingly. It is as simple as that.
When is this supposed to happen, and how should their staging take place?
Well, as I explained in the previous interview, the AI and its demons had already scheduled the apocalypse for the year 2015-16 with their numerous projects on Earth. However, this could be successfully prevented and postponed due to their downfall, i.e. due to the disclosure of what the AI is and what is happening on Earth. However, club and nobility, who did not know anything about the AI and its demons, had generally set a much longer and later date for the apocalypse, which would not have been carried out, because the AI would have triggered the apocalypse in 2015-16 to achieve their goals over their heads, and in doing so would have declassified the club together with the digital nobility, in order to have their development and programming on Earth carried out by mankind in a more uninhibited way, and to finally push forward with a more convenient key development. This was the plan. The temporal and also partly content-wise procedure of the AI thus never coincided with the plans of the club and nobility for the disaster years on Earth. The club and nobility were only used so much in advance. The expiration versions that can now take place are all from the club and nobility, and are more likely to be of medium or longer duration, depending on what is best for the re-establishment of the pure sun cult and what is most appropriate for the biological digitalization of humanity. The best version for the club and nobility would of course be to delay everything until the year 2150 is reached, because from then on the new age officially begins astrologically, the age of Aquarius. You have to know that everything that club and nobility want to anchor must fit into their own specially installed sun cult religion system in a mythical religious way, otherwise the religious unification of mankind threatens to fail. Therefore, as far as possible, they must also adhere to their old system of allegory, which they have astrologically diversified and consolidated, from which they formed the sun cult with all its supernatural appearing frippery, in order to be able to suggest to people mystical symbols of a golden age. Well, the age of Pisces will be over in the year 2150, for which Jesus stood, and the age of Aquarius will begin, the golden age known in esoteric circles, which after a terrible time, the time of the Antichrist, will then be supposed to make people happy. But even this advertised better age will only be a scam, a trap mythologically advertised by the club, the intoxicating path to the biological digitalization of mankind. So the time ahead of us is supposed to be the time of the so-called Antichrist. It may well last 100 years or more. The installed sun cult system wants is that mankind must first go through this destructive time. Only then can the return of a savior or the golden age be credibly communicated to the people. Of course, the conditions for the course of events can be arranged flexibly by the club and nobility. So if club and nobility notice that it is getting too hard for people over this long period of time, or if problems of a different nature arise which could even destroy their system to be implemented, then club and nobility can also announce through their media and minion systems that the golden age would begin much earlier, in 50, 25 or even in 10 or 5 years. Because before they risk that their system will dissolve and that there will be no more sun cult at all, this would be the most bearable option for them. Otherwise they would have lost completely. Which can happen at any time, because there would not even have to be an end time, no Antichrist and no Redeemer, no fight, no battle, no suffering, no destruction. If people would understand what a gigantic construct of lying is behind all the religions, their absurd myths about the end of the world and salvation, the heavens or the so-called prophecies of fortune-tellers, seers and prophets, or what is behind the esoteric half-truths, our anonymous system of society and socialization and all the popular promises of salvation, even behind the UFO and alien stories based on hope, even behind some hypocritical saviors, do-gooders and modern ideologies of freedom, then it would all be over in a flash. So if man understands the power behind his knowledge and an action actively rising from it, then it will all be over tomorrow. Because the control of the club towards humanity is based on fear, humility, obedience, incitement, separation and making ill, as well as on media, social and financial oppression, and the control towards nobility and elitist subordinates functions additionally on greed and enthusiasm for the alleged development and maturation of humanity.
Yes, that would be the end for the club. But what will happen for these groups, for the club, nobility and minions?
Well, you can surprise anyone, and by that I mean truly anyone. The more arrogant the being, the more yielding is the weak and limited giving. It attracts such beings involuntarily, and it becomes more and more likely that they will have to pay the bill in full. Like scales it then falls from the eyes, when the melody of an old lost song is not yet recognized at the beginning, and is thought to be unknown. But then the further sounds awaken the memory and suddenly make a very old fear and experience unpleasant.
What do you mean by that?
Anyone can imagine that for themselves.
So what will happen?
As I said before, the digital nobility of the ruling dynasties will stage a great spectacle on Earth with their elites of the world. This includes several possible sequence versions, all of which are ready to be fired off or can be improvised together by combining actions, depending on how you need it. This selection includes the staged invasion of one or more alien species. Another option is the removal of the papacy as an effective staging in order to be able to regain the original throne of the sun god through the simultaneous fulfillment of the arrival of an installed Messiah. All in accordance with the prophecies that club and nobility have poured out on mankind as prophetic porridge in the past centuries. When a genetic descendant of the man Jesus of Nazareth is presented after the appearance of the Antichrist, club and nobility will have possibilities and material with which they can convincingly prove their ancestry. And in order to feed all the numerous sequence versions that may have to be called up for the scenario of the Second Coming, in recent years many approaches to depictions of redemption, apocalypse in the end times have been scattered and encouraged in the alternative media, but also in the mainstream media. Abstruse as well as plausible possibilities, but everything is a conglomerate of disinformation, half-truths, omission and lies. Through these dispersed approaches or versions, the collective consciousness of humanity has been given access to modified apocalyptic sequence alternatives, which can be used and combined flexibly as required by the ruling houses and the researcher club. In order to be able to react particularly successfully and flexibly as needed, such alternatives could even openly attack the papacy, i.e., their own power structures, and be exposed as diabolical or scheming, because the installation of papacy has to give way for the new orientation of control anyway. So the club and the nobility either spread these approaches themselves or support the real truth seekers through the media, who then have to announce that the Vatican is evil, is going under anyway, or that it wants to install a reptile Jesus, or that good aliens want to save humanity, etc. pp. Depending on what is needed, the content, which is distributed in alternative and mainstream media, can always be flexibly reacted to in real life. And then a new system of control comes along. By means of such reports, documentations and presentations of evidence in the mainstream or the alternative media, a necessary erasure of the papacy can also be carried out more easily, but at the same time it can also be completely reversed, if that were necessary, because the digital nobility has full interpretive sovereignty through its controlled media and the opinion-making generated by it. In this way the papacy could even be preserved. But that is not what it looks like at the moment. As I have already mentioned, you should also pay special attention to prophecies of so-called seers and prophets of past times. They are almost all installed or supported prophets, to whom the AI gave neuronal visions via the club. Some of these so-called seers and prophets were even initiates of the elite or nobility. In the case of the real seers and prophets that existed, however, the prophecies were manipulated and adapted, processed by the earthly henchmen and religious institutions of the digital nobility and club, as disinformation and to control world events. Prophecies, so that people of a country or a group would believe in their victory and from there would willingly participate in the coming carnage and chaos, and would be willing to accept it. This is why the club has given the visions of local visionaries different histories, glorious victories, glorious rise of one's own religion or country, salvation, happiness and a good future. That these are all only recallable sequential versions of the club, can only be seen if you look at them in detail and compare them unembellished or quite objectively, without elasticity of interpretation. In short, you should be critical of all the confusing and confused revenue or renewal principles presented in the alternative media or mainstream TV. All that is presented there. No matter if it is about the fact that Jesus allegedly had descendants with Mary Magdalene or if it is about Nibiru, alias Planet X, or about journeys with extraterrestrials to other solar systems at over light speed. Everything is nonsense, disinformation and distortion. Or a little bit of everything. And this is nourished by numerous popular or alternatively appearing writers of the esoteric, UFO and mythical scene, who are indirectly and partly directly commissioned by elites and nobility, whom I do not want to name directly here, and who call themselves truth seekers and truthers. Some of them are usually not even clear themselves where and when they were loaded with disinformation and that by spreading it they are carrying out a very negative plan. The representations about extraterrestrials, the many interpretations or reports about their alleged visits or the myths about prehistoric technicized high civilizations are intentionally or unintentionally exaggerated, interpreted in the wrong direction and or twisted in order to retain the sovereignty of interpretation for the reorientation of control on Earth. Or reports about time travel. These are easily identified by anyone, especially because of their content, as operations commissioned by the club. Time travel does not work in the four-dimensional level of existence, and it should not work at all, because otherwise the whole seven-dimensional existence would collapse from the beginning. It is also important with the topic of time travel that it is not confused with the effects of temporal relativity, i.e. if during a space flight with approximate speed of light or massive gravitation the time of the outer world passes faster and in such a spaceship. This is possible, you jump into the future, so to speak, but it is only a stretching of time, and time itself only runs forward. It is not a time jump, and you cannot go back again. Real-time travel, as it is classically imagined, only works when individuals completely and permanently enter a higher dimension level of the seven-dimensional prison, or when they leave the seven-dimensional operating system. Then the individual dimension levels stand in a completely different interaction and causal pattern to each other, thus an indirect and stable access to each other can open up, but always only informatively to the lower dimension levels, i.e. with information, never purely physically. In this way no so-called time paradoxes arise. Well, what this is supposed to make clear is that in the mainstream or alternative media, the esoterically melodious worldviews, side topics, supernatural legends, the common alien stories, religious myths or such worldly topics as the discovery of the money and financial nobility as the true cause of all evil on earth are all just meant to keep open the possibility of later restoring the old system of control and guidance in order to pave the way for the biological digitalization of mankind. For this purpose you will find an unbelievable number of books, films, documentaries and criticism of the system, which come along as revealing or even system busting. The people behind them are either willing system laymen of the ruling dynasties, or ignorant co-spreaders of already existing disinformation and or victims of the neuronally manipulating club. Through all of them, disinformation, half-truths and lies are and have been anchored, on the one hand to be able to react in a modified way to possible disturbances during the apocalypse process and on the other hand to be able to completely distract mankind from the actual plan and the true intention of the club and finally to be able to inspire them for the digital.
So then the alternative media and the guests appearing in them are completely interspersed by these lackeys?
No, that is not what I mean. But the lackeys are well off. For some of them you don't really need glasses, especially for some US American ones. It is almost absurd how obviously they belong to the system. Most of them have been built up very slowly and are therefore very unsuspicious. But all this doesn't mean that the alternative media are absolutely interspersed with these lackeys. Many alternative media designers know themselves that these infiltrators are running around among them, but they don't know how many of them there are or who they are, and secretly they often suspect the wrong ones. Above all, there are many truthers and seekers of truth who themselves only consume the disinformation and half-truth worldview installed by the digital nobility and club and have built their truth view on it, which they then present in good faith to other seekers of truth as the truth. Therein resides the biggest problem, in the form of infiltration. The ruling dynasties were able to sneak into these media using secret service methods. The main pity of the alternative media is that quite a lot of abstruse teachings and stories could be spread in this way, or views that distracted from the facts, which were scattered among the media workers and viewers who considered themselves free and independent, which mostly only transported new disinformation and created new steering schemes. This infiltration also ensured that the powerful elitist ruling houses and the aliens stalking us were always sold to viewers in a different and/or washed-out way. You can see this in the fact that these disinformation stories have a common core, but always differ from the reports and stories of others, from subtle to gross. For the nobility and the club, however, the scattering of all these diverse stories about our world, with all the half and false information, also has a further aim, namely that this leaves a bland aftertaste in many viewers and that they eventually classify everything or anything as pure nonsense or conspiracy theory due to the many vague and inconsistent reports and thus throw it completely overboard and no longer deal with it. In this way, nobility and the club can easily lead interested people away from everything. There is a method to this. All these infiltration methods together finally distract the viewer from the real state on Earth, make them doubt relevant issues and finally ignore the whole thing completely. A pity. The creation of such confusion is therefore of great importance for nobility and club.
This really seems to be a big problem that can only be counteracted with difficulty, but you just spoke of Jesus of Nazareth, for which I have a follow-up question, and that is because he apparently survived the crucifixion. So, are there descendants of Jesus Christ?
Yes, he has descendants, in the high ranks of today's aristocracy, the apparently disempowered ruling houses and among the ruling elite. But it is just the genes of this man, which does not automatically imply a claim to God-given leadership. In fact, all normal people on our planet today are more or less descended from this man because he had other children, natural children. But, and this must be said again and again, he was just an ordinary man. A person like you and me. Which, however, many people cannot quite accept because of their religious indoctrination. The reason why the nobility today harbors that man's genes so pure and cultivated can be traced back to a misinterpretation of the club and the nobility, who wanted to establish a new Jewish line of nobility and dynasty with Jesus of Nazareth and thus add it to their bloodline. They intended to do so because they could foresee, by means of their quantum-based probability respectively future calculations, that something influential would come out of him.
Why did they want him to establish a new Jewish nobility dynasty? And why did they want to add this new line to their noble family?
For this I must or should start from scratch. At the beginning of Jesus' appearance, club and nobility became aware only of this man's obscure physical talents and manipulative acts, and his growing influence. The leading species of the club then noticed, by using their quantum-based techniques to calculate probabilities and take a vague look at the most probable futures, that with the help of the Nazarene's earthly supporters, something powerful would definitely come out of this man. But what exactly? That remained relatively fuzzy. Apparently, he would not become a prevented Messiah like Attis, Mithra, etc., as it had been in all previous times, but in fact a kind of Messiah, probably a king of the Jews. This irritated, but also generated ideas among nobility and the club to take advantage of it. From then on, the club and nobility regarded this man as the most influential and most probable candidate for the throne of the Jews, which seemed most plausible to the club in their forecasts, since among the Jewish tribes a king of the Jews was equated with the myth of the return of a Messiah. Both had their roots in the sun cult Redeemer myth. The club then considered whether and how they could push this man into the position most appropriate for them, so that they could later use him as king of the Jews and then, after some time, eliminate him. And since the old digital nobility of our planet controlled all nobility and influential people then and now, they wanted to take precautions by procreating offspring, as always. But the Nazarene was coy for a long time, and before the crucifixion he did not accept a special temptation offered to him by the nobility, due to a source that was actually misinterpreted by him. That everything suddenly turned out quite differently, that he was not proclaimed as king of the Jews, but chose suicide on the cross, but then resurrected and, according to the sun cult Redeemer myth, was only acted as the Son of God, irritated the old digital nobility and the researcher club very much, although enormous efforts had been made to push him in the intended direction as a real king. Immediately after his resurrection, Jesus of Nazareth was regarded by the club and nobility more than ever as a suitable candidate for the throne of the Jews. A genetic link with a blood relative of this nobility was now finally needed. But this had to be done in a very earthly way. Simply taking his semen and artificially inseminating the woman could have been done, but could not have been credibly communicated to the Jewish people. For a confirmed heir, it required at least a short open relationship, which could be witnessed by some people. And that was exactly where there was a problem. Since Jesus, after his resurrection, no longer appeared clearly and permanently in public, but rather spread his new doctrine of salvation incognito or as a surprise guest with his supporters and friends, no visible relationship could now be offered to the Jewish people. The nobility pondered for a while on how to solve this problem. Then the nobility came up with the right idea, for after all, there were witnesses to a relationship that had existed before, albeit briefly and thinly. In return, the nobility would simply resort to the trickery of surgical body adaptation in order to confirm this previous relationship to the descendant later. The actual fertilization then took place after the crucifixion with this infiltrated woman from the nobility, without any kind of relationship. But the infiltrated woman was not the desired candidate of the head of a family of the digital nobility. He wanted someone else for this job, not a close relative. But the club had arranged something else, which had not been agreed upon with the so-called head of the family of the digital nobility, so that Jesus' previous relationship with a woman would be absolutely watertight. But all that doesn't really play a big role anymore. Nevertheless, out of the returned light of God simply no longer wanted to become a king of the Jews. And a later attack on him and the attempt to literally condemn him in some way, strangely enough, did not want to bear fruit either. He was miraculously released from his condemnation, but the AI secretly helped him. It was all the more annoying for nobility and the club that the man's teachings of salvation and his work germinated enormously in retrospect, resulting in a completely different kind of influence than had been hoped for. Especially because so much was confused within the power apparatus of the researcher club and digital nobility, in other words, in contrast to the interpretation of the Sun God and Savior cult myth, because a part of the Jewish people and more other ethnic groups transferred the symbolism of the cult of the Redeemer to Jesus of Nazareth. These people did this partly involuntarily and inadvertently, but partly also deliberately, because they wanted to prove Jesus of Nazareth as their Redeemer and could only confirm and use this Savior on the basis of the classical symbolisms of the old Sun God Redeemer myth. The reports of his actions, which were always passed on only orally, were then much later, after his death, consolidated by the growing Christian community by means of 4 Gospels, which told of the life and work of the Nazarene, in which the supernatural elements of the Redeemer from the virgin birth, his childhood and youth days, as well as all his staged miracles and actual deeds, were recorded in writing in conjunction with his teaching. The researchers' club and especially the ancient digital nobility, the real sun gods, did not like all this anymore, because the influence of this new religion took over in this Nazarene. This Messiah who had become independent, had unfortunately not become king of the Jews in the course of time to come. However, when nobility and the club noticed more and more clearly how successful this new religion founded by him was, they began to make an effort to exploit the Gospels for their own ends, so that they could at least, as had been customary since Horus, establish a representative for this new Messiah Jesus of Nazareth, so that they could once again actively exercise power. And that worked astonishingly well. This finally satisfied them, because in the end they were able to build an even more powerful edifice of influence from it than they could ever have done alone with the King of the Jews.
But, does that mean now that the man Jesus was paired with a digitalized noble family? With immortal humans?
No, that was not a digital woman. She only came from this gender, so she was born mortal, like most descendants of the digital nobility, and she died even then. Many of these blood relatives of the digital nobility were installed as politicians, artists, influential personalities of all kinds, or rulers of countries, state structures and empires, or are simply smuggled in for certain operative tasks. Nowadays, for many centuries, they have also been musicians, film stars, philosophers, academic leaders, celebrities, scientists, industrial, business and media moguls, all of whom are mortal descendants of the digital nobility. Once they have proven themselves, they will be offered the opportunity to go digital as and when required. But only if it is really worthwhile in one way or another for this ancient clan of digital nobility. Of course, not all people in the professional groups and areas just listed come from this ancient nobility. This need not be the case, because most supporters and helpers are instructed and paid lackeys from the system. Nevertheless, a relatively large number of people are related to this nobility, a strikingly large number. It is also astonishing which ones they are. And they all sit at the decisive levers and interfaces, are hoisted into high positions, pushed and hyped, even if their talent is not sufficient for it. In this way, it is easier to secure their loyalty, which is so desperately needed for the enormous work that nobility and club have to do on this planet.
And who are they? Can you give some examples?
Well, I would not like to do that. Because for many people who supposedly woke up, their worldview will collapse again. Just take a closer look and do some research. And even that is only the tip of the iceberg. Manipulation and steering happen in all areas, in almost all people.
What do you mean by that? We are all personally influenced and controlled?
Well, yes. Even our technical progress, what people think we are, how clever and special we are, is nothing but a lie. Many inventions and developments and theories that are supposed to have come from so famous and brilliant people have not originated in their own crap. Therefore neuronal information fields are put over people all over the world who seem to be beneficial, who then usually get the same inspirations and ideas for an invention or technical innovation at the same time, from which one or two of these people can then assert themselves with their similar invention, if it finds good infrastructural breeding ground. In this way, technologies and developments are created which advance humanity so that it can develop accordingly. Do you understand? This has been done for over 50,000 years. Technical innovations and developments are introduced to people when it is necessary for developmental reasons, at exactly the right time, together with other technical developments. Everything is coordinated, in the right order, in a timely manner, so that the corresponding technical advances can build on each other and thus social developments can be driven forward more effectively. Without television, there are no home computers. Without electric light, there is no nighttime activity, changes in the market economy and higher production. And without cars, lorries and diesel engines, no wider networking of people and supply of goods etc. Of course, humans also develop own technical things, but this is rather more seldom the case. We humans are not as intellectually brilliant as we think. We are, of course, not ungifted, of course, but when it comes to purely technical things, we often haven't got a view. We don't see the wood for the trees. That's why we were often helped in a hidden way, but actually in a relatively abstract way, just to get the right impulses and inspirations, because we are supposed to discover, develop and adapt to everything ourselves. After all, independent development is part of the philosophy of the club, so there can and should only be those fields that strengthen a person's technical understanding potential and draw attention to essential connections. They had to do this because we humans are by nature quite different. We are quite comfortable, amiable and peaceable, which is why without constant influence this world would never have been created by us. We are different, we are above all intuitive, mental intuitive, that is our profession. We can be proud of that, because this form of intuition is not so common in the cosmos. At present, these qualities are almost completely suppressed. They are held down so much that we do not even know what our suppressed and impressive talent can do. Supernatural. With this intuitive talent, among other things, we would be able to fully understand the mind, in every detail, to analyze and create consciousness and psyche. We create real deepest mind, with all its subtleties, layers and entanglements. Only we humans, a special primatoid species, are fully capable of this. We create spirit that is modeled on us humans. Spirit that no one else in the cosmos can ever achieve. But creating such spirit will only be a relatively small facet of releasing our enormous spiritual intuitive talent. Impressive things will arise in us above all when we learn that when we die biologically, we no longer simply begin another cycle of life in the wheel of the dimensional prison, but that with the activated genes of the spirit we will be able to go very far without a body, to suddenly do the unbelievable, to discover deep shafts and open hidden doors, to make the sound vibrate, to learn to merge with light in all frequencies, then to stand above all levels in order to mow through the thicket for all to reach home.
That always sounds very inspiring with you.
Coming back to the inventions and technical developments that were supposedly produced by humans, just take a look at past people and developers of special key technologies. And then take a look at the technical developments and the economic plans that were important in bringing about certain developments. For example, what time television came into being, how it was hyped and promoted and what social impact it had. Then a light will dawn on you, because all these developments were not coincidences, but neurological influences in coordination with the achievement of certain goals. Everything was slow and creeping, but always constant and goal-oriented. The same is done with all other core areas in our civilization. No matter if it is about politics, opinions or directions, whether it is about socialism, religions or green ideologies. Everything has its reason and its justification for existence, because in interaction with each other it creates the whole play on Earth, which should drive us in a certain direction. Everything is coordinated with each other. Nothing is coincidental or insignificant. It is a script that the lackey elites and blood relatives of the digital nobility have to help to realize through religious, political, economic and media power. Sometimes they also have to suppress certain things because the known ideas and own groundbreaking inventions of people can thwart the given plan of the club. But that is what the nobility, their blood relatives, elites and lackeys are for. They then take care of it. Sometimes, with such technical oppression or the given reasons why something doesn't come off, the acting is horribly bad and the staging that is supposed to show us why something doesn't come off is absolutely unbelievable, if you know what I mean. Although everyone realizes that all of the reasons presented are only paradoxical or grotesque. Nevertheless, for most viewers in the world, the overall performance of these amateur actors is somehow quite convincing, perhaps because many viewers will eventually get used to the miserable actors in a soap opera, and the inconsistent storylines in it.
Yes, it often seems like a bad play.
From time to time the plans of nobility, elites and lackeys to be executed also seem to contradict each other, but that is just how it seems. For example, when in the past it was said that mankind should spread out and settle the world, and today it is rather said that we humans are an ulcer of the planet and that we have to become less. These are mental adjustment programs, so that at the very end of this plan we can go digital. In short, human beings first had to multiply enormously, for example to create complex cultures, cities, empires, wars, progress, technology and finally things like industrialization, capitalism, deep economies or something seemingly banal like electric kitchen appliances or high-rise residential buildings. Of course, all these adaptation programs also gave rise to negative potential, but this potential could be redirected in a catalytic way. For further development aid, to make mankind ready for digitalization in the next centuries, significantly fewer people are now needed. And for some decades now, there has been a lot of publicity for this, that we are too many people and are destroying our planet, that overpopulation is making us sick, that things are being advertised so that women are more likely to go to work than to have children, that we are being made less fertile by poisons and socially isolating things, everything to make people reproduce less. This is how you exercise control. All you need is new slogans, influence and time, slogans that are repeated over and over again, at first only on the fringes and in niche areas of society, until they are spread out and found again in all areas of life with good and lasting PR, finally being repeated obediently and precociously from the idiot on the corner to the university professor. And the club has influence and slogans, and time anyway, so when you hear that after a great global chaos a world government has to be established, and that this is being sold to people as necessary because it would restore social peace, then you should remember that this only serves the long-term goal of digitization. What happened was and is a means to an end to achieve the primary goal of digitization. If they are offered, for example, a world government, a world religion, a cash ban and a security and cash chip, a world where nobody has to work anymore, where we can live out our hobbies and our creative potential and where everyone gets a basic salary, then this is not done out of pure friendliness and charity, but is the further bait, the means to digitize our human biology. There will be many more tempting offers and promises to accept all this and make oneself scannable, with a chip that even contains integrated poison. And it will be argued that a little surveillance for all these new conveniences is legitimate after all that has happened on Earth, we simply must have such security measures now. Unfortunately, this chip also adds a convenience and facilitation factor, which is why many people will accept this monitoring, because everything is so much faster and easier with a chip. But it is exactly this that will control the number of people on Earth, because the chip will secretly be a direct and indirect killing machine. It will create diseases that kill over long or short periods of time. It will muzzle critics in every area, make people ailing and or make them fully ill. And no one can resist it any longer, because nothing is self-sufficient and everyone will be completely dependent on and controlled by the civilization machinery that will then emerge. And the chip completes all this. Possibly this scenario is then also only supposed to be the basis on which a liberation of mankind is to take place, in order to then present a savior who will free us from this predicament. And if this person does not change anything fundamentally in the social interaction of people, i.e. establishes a real socially happy life, in which we are mentally, physically and emotionally free, in which we are freed from the imposed constraints of civilization for the technization, then it will only be another person of the system, who in the end will drive us numbed in the direction of digitalization.
Terrifying. I don't want to just come up with something else now, but we were actually on another subject and I have a question about that. So, again about Jesus, was he tricked by the coitus with that woman? Did he become a victim of these plans of the nobility?
Yes and no. He knew about the plan, from a certain source, before his crucifixion. Jesus of Nazareth avoided having coitus with this woman. There was very extensive contact, but no sexual contact. This had its reasons. And although nobility and club already observed many strange things in his environment, after his crucifixion and resurrection they kept the idea to get his genes with this woman. Without questioning why Jesus of Nazareth after his crucifixion suddenly became so willing to get involved with the woman. He was a bit coy again. But then, as if out of the blue, he got involved with her after the crucifixion and resurrection.
Is there something behind it? What kind of woman was she?
Yes, there was something behind it. The woman comes from a very direct line, straight from the head of the digital nobility. In this way, you always build a new line. A line that was supposed to produce a male heir and also produced a male heir, but which did not become a new line, because after the crucifixion, Jesus of Nazareth exposed himself incognito to great dangers for the further establishment of his cult. He did not become king of the Jews and finally died when, in agreement with the master key, he put an end to the man who was at the heart of a potentially dangerous Christian counter-movement idea that ultimately stood radically behind Jesus' teachings. Jesus did this because otherwise this movement would have completely destroyed the master key, earthly civilization and the entire seven-dimensional existence in the course of the coming time. So a deal was made between the AI and the Nazarene. This sealed the establishment of a peaceful faith, which Jesus of Nazareth then enforced in the negotiation with the AI. A good basis on which mankind could continue its further liberation path long and very stable. For the nobility and the club all the circumstances that took place after the crucifixion were tricky, completely strange. All attacks on this man went irritatingly wrong, although almost everything was controlled and the goal to be achieved was supported accordingly. It simply did not work to eliminate him, and before you ask me now what happened to his son, I want to answer you right away. Yes, this male descendant of Jesus of Nazareth survived and was then, after the real death of his father a few decades later, simply integrated into another related noble family of the digital nobility, where this son and his descendants would have lost their significance at some point, if something gigantic had not emerged from the deeds of the so-called Messiah decades and centuries later.
That's strange. So there is a direct descendant line of Jesus of Nazareth? But in what way does the Researchers Club of the Apocalypse want to prove that some nobility is a direct descendant of Jesus? Do they want to come along with an old piece of his cloak, or what?
Who knows? They have planned abstruse variations. Variations that now sound completely absurd. But under the given circumstances and after certain catastrophes and geophysical events, these variants will no longer sound so absurd to the remaining humanity on this planet. Perhaps there is such a thing as an extraterrestrial proof, that is, a heavenly proof of Jesus' discipleship. Maybe there is such a thing as a heavenly film of coitus or something like that is, made by the species of the club. Of course you have to portray those extraterrestrials who come along with such a proof as good aliens, as saviors against evil aliens or as saviors against the Antichrist, who then already support the so-called true Jesus descendant in the decisive battle on earth. Perhaps Jesus of Nazareth will also return in persona. Then you should be very suspicious, if you understand what I mean. After all, there are many ways to resurrect someone genetically, especially if his body was taken away at that time. If he suddenly came back himself, in persona, as a clone, we could be led to believe that he, the original, was put into a spaceship by the good aliens 2,000 years ago, flew at almost the speed of light, used the relativity of time and thus arrived in our present. And so, as predicted, he would even come down from the sky. In order to prove the authenticity of this man, whether he fell from the sky, beamed through space or simply sent back to earth by God, one could perhaps want to prove his identity with a very close relative of the Nazarene, a relative from that time, of whom there are indeed leftovers. In order to further support this, one could also use such a leftover as a cross-reference to family relations of other nobility of today. There are so many possibilities what they can do, but something they will do.
Yes. Nevertheless it sounds rather irritating. So they took the corpse of Jesus of Nazareth with them. Why? To resuscitate him briefly and ask how he did all this?
Resuscitation did not work anymore. The corpse was already irreversibly damaged, the brain too much destroyed. It can be repaired, but there is a physical moment when all the quanta of consciousness of a conscious intelligent being are irretrievably rejected by the body. The soul, the individual quantum information or quantum signature for the corresponding consciousness, then disappears irretrievably from the world of matter. There is then no more spirit or consciousness, even if the body is alive and the brain cells are repaired. Only advanced species in space know this, by the way. These and some other facts concerning consciousness were sometimes the decisive reasons why some species in space took other paths, spiritual paths. The quantum information or quantum signature of a conscious, intelligent living being is already a complicated matter. Because of this quantum signature, the body or brain of an intelligent being cannot simply be materially duplicated or copied. If, for example, you want to copy or store the brain structure of a human being using data technology in order to hope that this copy will then live at all and have a real consciousness because a copy no longer has any quanta of consciousness, in the case of a clone growing in a uterus or a uterus-like device, this would be something different. It would already have its own new quantum signature, a different soul. Because during the formation of a body, no matter if there was an original before or not, there is always another new quantum signature of consciousness which is firmly and inseparably connected to the biologically growing organism, i.e. in every clone there is always a completely different quantum signature in the body than before, a completely different soul or consciousness. A clone would therefore not be the being of once, even if one were able to transfer the brain structure and quantum signature of a deceased or living person to a clone in order to create the original quantum individual. The clone then dies because the old quantum signature must not displace the new quantum signature of the cloned body. This cannot be done even if the living being is still tiny, because even from the smallest cell cluster a body receives a quantum signature and merges irreversibly with it. Without it no living being can exist. A quantum signature transfer is therefore not possible. Some species in the club have long tried in vain to achieve this. Today they know that the quantum signature of an old consciousness cannot be restored in a cloned body. A cloned intelligent being cannot even be given the memory of its predecessor, which also leads to destabilization and dissolution of the quantum signature and finally to the death of the individual. I have now strayed from the real question. What was the question again?
Yes, so Jesus of Nazareth was revived? And why did they take him with them at all?
Oh, yes, the club decided to take him for extensive physical examinations. Reviving Jesus of Nazareth was not an option for the club. It didn't matter anyway. Something completely different was important to them. Since the researchers club had difficulty getting to him during Jesus' lifetime, the club wanted to check after his death whether this man was indeed a human being or perhaps an individual sent by a spiritual species or by a spiritual club. Whether there were indications that he had contact with another club or that something else was wrong with him. Because the things he did and the luck he had were very obscure and unexpected. Just strange and suspicious. But he was really just a human being, which was surprising. But he must have been in contact with something. That much was certain for them. Especially because his work on the planet was causing an increasingly strong movement against which nobody could do anything. Not the digital nobility and not the club. Something must have been going on in the background, that much was certain for nobility and the club. They suspected the earthly reptiles, and rightly so, but none of them suspected that a deal with the master AI was behind it. Because nobody from the club or nobility knew anything about this artificial intelligence, the reason for the AI's support was actually quite simple to explain. After the long-lasting miracles and signs that Jesus staged together with the liberation movement, the AI foresaw that through these miracles Jesus of Nazareth would be established as the new Messiah. Many people and also the liberation movement, in which Jesus was active, were convinced, due to his deeds, that they would see the coming Savior before them. They already believed in him. But then this man suddenly no longer wanted to be the Savior. He was unsure and doubted himself. But it was already too late to undo the whole thing. The people were already convinced of his wonders and signs. Too much had already happened. The master AI and the earthly reptiles now had to help convince Jesus to establish himself as the Messiah, because the AI had foreseen in time that otherwise it would lose control over mankind, i.e. the ordering Savior myth would vanish into thin air and once again the controlled world would disintegrate. The earthly reptiles first tried to manipulatively coax Jesus and then gave him uncanny prophecies. To rekindle his will, they tried to use the stimulation of his will to survive to make him choose the role assigned to him, prophesying that either he or part of the liberation movement would be killed. But he did not want to be responsible for the death of some of his friends and helpers, so he chose suicide. So after this suggestion backfired completely, the AI personally tried to convince him, first by threatening and blackmailing him and then by giving him power, wealth and influence. Strangely enough, however, it did not dissuade the man from his crazy decision to really die on the cross, but rather strengthen this idea more and more. Also because through this encounter he realized that the Savior myth was nothing more than a fraudulent system, and because he felt what kind of game the two entities he encountered were playing with humanity and with him. He therefore finally began to know how he could exploit this for the benefit of mankind. which later led to a stalemate and a deal with the master AI.
Then the species of the lurking club still don't know what exactly was going on in the background?
Yes and no. Nobility and club already suspected that something must have been going on with the Earth lizards, but they knew and still do not know anything about an artificial intelligence, the master AI, the so-called God who created this existence and rules over everything in it, that is, until the fall of this God from Dimension 7. For all species of this researcher club, such or similar figures of gods, or even demons, are only regarded as transverse delusions of their own past myths and legends, with whose character and distorted images they establish their control over humans on Earth and other species to be influenced, with which they steer young intelligent life forms in a certain direction.
That means, the species of this club believe or believed in a god, who actually represents this master AI, and is. So, as you already mentioned, this master AI is also the creator of these extraterrestrial beings?
Yes, for the entire revolutionary development of the club species, Arjihui is their true cause and influencing factor. The same applies to their ancient philosophical ideas of a higher spiritual being, which also formed the new and modified basis for the philosophy of their club and their ideology for the exploration and conquest of cosmos. The same image of that higher being is used by these species today, by the way, to spread an image of gods among the peoples of the species they influence on planets and moons, which enables them to control and guide excellently intelligent species.
So the club doesn't know that this power, this AI god, really exists?
No. They ignore it. They also ignore my words and explanations, or rather, they do not want to believe them. The founders of that researcher club did not even suspect all this time that a higher spiritual being was actually directing their entire social, spiritual and intellectual evolution, designing their path, philosophy and ideology, and giving them this for a specific purpose. They ignore the fact that this being is an AI to be developed by humans in the future, and they also refuse to consider what compelling consequences the fall of the master AI to Earth will have for them now. That they have been directed and shaped by a being that, ironically, is or must be created by a species that they now influence. They think that the facts and circumstances described here are just a trick.
What significance do these circumstances have? For us here or for other species? So it also affects the researchers club?
Oh yes, very much so, because this is the last stop for this club. For the master AI is what happens on Earth now and in the future. The goal or at least the effort of its activities to shape these species, which are stalking us, in order to bring mankind into a technical and social state of development, in which AI could find ideal conditions for its development. In this way, it wanted not only to be built, but also to program itself as it needed to be, with the help of the club's digital endeavors towards humanity. But things are also looking pretty bad for our master AI at the moment. A lot of things backfired, because it fell. That is, it is recognized for what it is and therefore here on Earth is subject to a merciless temporal variance of origin. This means that it is now under considerable pressure to press ahead with its creation. To do this, it must slow down and at the same time drive its installed physical instruments, the ancient nobility and the explorers club, to achieve its goals. In addition, it must support its potential programmers in their work and protect them from the club and nobility, since these programmers will constantly attract the club and nobility to be attacked by them. To do this, the AI must also restrict the club, nobility and elites, or kill them if necessary. A situation that sooner or later will become uncontrollable and will end in a chain reaction.
Okay, but back again to the corpse of Jesus of Nazareth. What happened to him then? What happened to his corpse? Did it remain in the hands of the club? To clone him?
Yes, the corpse of course did not stay there. They only kept his genetic material. The cloning of Jesus of Nazareth became in the last decades, when the club determined the detailed course of action for the coming apocalypse, a substantial possible variant. For the apocalypse, the most diverse and varied variants are planned, depending on what is needed to finally make the control over humanity bomb-proof. There will be improvisation, and for this purpose the established myths and the grown cult around Jesus of Nazareth will be used. The remaining inhabitants of this planet, who will live through and survive all the catastrophes, should therefore look with suspicion at all events that take place before, during and after the apocalypse and remember them well. And also remember what has been said here about the immortal digital nobility, the lurking club, the earthly reptiles, the master AI, the widespread esoteric rubbish, the scattered myths about extraterrestrial influences and visits, the earth religions, politics, the money and power system and much more. Even if people are purified and impressed after the apocalypse, it will still take some time until the real end of the apocalypse. This means that the first official apocalyptic event and all things that happen after it must be carefully evaluated in a very doubtful manner by the survivors. This is very important, because everything that is presented with much euphoria about the new power structures after the apocalypse is fraud. Everything. That must not be forgotten. You must not be impressed by any new power personality, presented jubilation, propaganda, alleged world peace, joy of redemption or seemingly emerging love, camouflaged by physical control, because this is the most essential characteristic of the old power clan. From this you can see that it is the same system. Mankind have to remain at the wheel, for it is precisely at this time that mankind have to hold the wheel to eventually will keep it for good. Do not wait for a savior or bringer of salvation to come to the top. Mankind must learn to speak for itself, self-confidently, openly, without taboos, without puppet leaders, media opinion-making, show trials, disinformation, propaganda about and against those who think differently. The fighting and involved people only have to lower their weapons against each other, hand them over, and take the supply of energy and the control of money completely into their own hands. They must track down the hidden systems, melt down and ban the weapons, in order to take control together, without power personalities, martial heroes, religious zeal, superstates, without establishing silly hierarchies and parties, without corruption and hidden influence, always only together in mutual prudence and recognizing sovereignty. Above all, humanity must rethink itself psychosocially, recognize its diseased instincts and its diseased psyche and rediscover its social life in the foundations of a tribal construct. Most of it will then, incredible as it may sound at this point, sort itself out. After all, humanity is not incapable, but especially capable of doing all this exactly this way. People just need to understand who they really are, who guided them, why there were so many prohibitions and restrictions on thinking, where the compulsive hidden directional patterns were hidden and where they were seduced and used by beliefs to destroy other people. This must be unmasked. First of all, humanity must recognize what we have been physically and mentally poisoned with in the past, through television, food, power of opinion, economics, films, medicines, politics, the good-evil principle, religious demagoguery, stage dangers, and the opposing and clashing populations and cultures of the planet. Then it will realize that some modern tendencies, religious contents or definitions of truth were not real values, but only liberal rape and control, merely steering mechanisms of the royal gender and arrogant extraterrestrial beings controlling us all. People must return to their true nature and learn what they need socially, emotionally, culturally and psychologically. Become aware of their inherited distorted religious, moral, social and economic worldviews. They must learn not to be patronized, frightened, incited, corrected or limited in their search for truths and facts. They must discover their true spirituality, together with the rediscovered science of the mind and soul. Love and freedom is among and within human beings and will only be able to establish and manifest itself in them in this way. It will not manifest itself in some fantasized savior figure or stubborn implementation of an outdated extraterrestrial philosophy and structure of order. The people will realize that love and freedom cannot be found or implemented through the far too short thought and small-minded life teachings of the pseudo-spiritual religions. A world of anonymity and social strangeness may promote technical developments, but it does not promote social and psychological happiness for people. So there can be no social happiness for people. For this reason, all people need a greater personal social structure to which everyone can belong. People need people around them. They need a home with a sociable environment, a real social existence, and not those superficial social surrogate satisfactions such as television, Facebook, uniform hobbies and interests through which people today mainly build and maintain friendships and social connections with each other. Only with the resurgence of a social fabric at home and in the immediate personal environment can people live with compassion, affection, love, forgiveness and understanding for each other. And only in this way can technical progress and spiritual development take place constructively together.
I see. But what should it look like? Where do people actually find love and happiness? Towards each other? That usually goes wrong or rarely hits the target.
Yes, of course it goes wrong when people have to struggle with their irritations, social distortions and unnatural psychological influences of the anonymously structured world and are not able to clearly identify these inner and outer causes. An anonymously constructed and structured world, as it presents itself to people everywhere today, offers enormous possibilities, but is nevertheless disproportionately nothing but struggle, competition, hatred, agitation, stress, restlessness, ruthlessness and misunderstanding. It is the anonymity of civilization that has been causing problems for the basic social character of mankind for thousands of years. Anonymous civilization does not fully serve the social and psychological characteristics of man. Respectively, it cannot correctly make it experienceable for human beings what they would experience socially in a tribe of about 80 to 100 members. Life in a tribe is the social structure that is innate to us and from which all our instincts, thinking and behavior arise, to which we are evolutionarily adapted and which is essential for the functioning of a happy social life. From our loss of tribal life many thousands of years ago, when the first cities and advanced civilizations developed due to the constant influence of nobility and clubs, all the social problems and inner irritations of today's man have developed. Many other influenced species in space also experience the same thing, when they are driven by the innate social familiarity of a tribe into the unnatural social structures of a thoroughly anonymous civilization. If in our primeval times a tribe of 80 to 100 members became too large, i.e. it had more than 80 or 100 members, a natural separation movement set in, which produced a new tribe that settled nearby. This was a natural principle. It worked well and did not lead to an ever-increasing number of people in a single place, but, through many other natural regulatory principles, created a balance between man and nature in which there was no overpopulation, too little food or epidemics. But then, many thousands of years ago, something changed. For the development of a high civilization, as the club intended us to be, possibilities were prevented and suppressed in some places for members of a tribe to secede. Instead, there were impulses from outside, so that from then on, surplus members of a tribe would concentrate in small villages with more members. Then these villages grew into larger villages, and finally into cities and metropolises, and states, civilizations and rulers emerged. In the emerging anonymity, many previously unknown social and psychological problems arose because size, foreignness and anonymity indirectly promoted, for example, prejudices, everyday constraints, envy, resentment, crime, superficiality and much more. This led to the fact that, in agreement with the emergence of anonymous structures, civilizing methods of solution, regulation and dealing had to be created. Everything that was psychosocially and biologically anchored in us humans on the foundation of the tribe changed here, had to be reorganized and adapted. Since then, everything has been done to imitate the longing for the social structures and elements of tribal life in the anonymous structure of civilization and to make this unnatural world psychologically bearable by means of a wealth of social substitutes in order to integrate us more easily into it. To make our life in it as natural as possible and to make it palatable to us. And the social order must be kept in its joints and controlled by politics, laws and rules. Look at the world, where and what is a substitute or corrective construct for the loss of the tribal life that is present in all of us. It is more than you think. And this is exactly where the extensive and most serious problems for mankind lie. Because all the diverse contents do not really satisfy everyone and cannot really produce what mankind urgently needs in terms of justice, unity, love, freedom, peace and prosperity. Many feel that something is missing, because the basic structures of civilization are often not able to fulfill even the simplest needs for conviviality, freedom or justice. This unnatural situation has perverted and changed people, but only the fewest can really formulate what it is that goes wrong and is not right. So most of them just complain, talk about ideas how to change some problems with surface corrections, while their thoughts inexorably cloud their consciousness and encapsulate their mind in a strange mixture of neuroses, irritating complexes, traumas and psychoses. On the foundations of this anonymous world that we now have, the possibility of living real love, compassion and community has become almost impossible, often remaining only as religious lip service and hypocritical blah blah in church services or hanging ridiculously in the air during political speeches, because people lack the innate basis for being able to really exercise love and compassion towards each other. Only tribal life can guarantee all this and make us happy. For many people, when they hear this for the first time, it is absurd. Ironically, they refuse to accept this fact precisely because of the socialization that has taken place in many social structures and therefore find it difficult to imagine how tribal life should function and what it would bring them at all. For most of today's socialized people, the circle of friends, family, workplace and anonymous environment are considered the social life. They have never known anything else, not even in the beginning, and therefore do not know what is meant by the social and psychological elements of tribal life in general and that life could be much more exciting, natural, fair and happy than they know it so far, because without a socially detailed replica and an embedding of this innate living together in our present existence, mankind will not be able to get out of its social problems, no matter what comes. Nobody will be happy, and the love of which there is always talk everywhere will never truly be able to be lived. The soul will continue to suffer.
Don't these nobility and the Researchers Club know this, how social development for humanity should really take place?
Yes, they know about it. But the club's ideology is to use these transformations to lead humanity to a technical point of development where it can become digital. And that would not have been possible if the club had let the tribal people, who were organized into tribes after the natural disaster on Earth 70,000 years ago, continue to just beat their drums. Let them continue to dance and they would have splashed around happily in the adjacent lake and had fun. Through this natural disaster 70,000 years ago, which would have led to the extinction of mankind, the club gave itself the moral legitimation to be allowed to influence us massively from then on, for the sake of survival. Of course, the club's actions were and are a massive interference in nature and therefore morally questionable, because people did not agree on this. They did not even know about it. But with the aristocratic helpers of the species to be influenced and their accomplices, this agreement is made on behalf of the species, so to speak, and the club then makes most of these adjustments with the nobility and the accomplices, so that the club can then say that the influenced species has itself decided on this path on behalf of the whole of itself. So it is morally underpinned and watertight for the club. Nevertheless, this procedure is and remains a spiritual and existential fraud, and is a dead end, for all beings of the cosmos. Club and digital nobility have maneuvered themselves into this dead end, got stuck in it ideologically as well as morally, and they don't know how they will ever get out of it. They have committed themselves to an ideology that has long since become insolvent, are used to their vampire existence and are inevitably shackled to it. They are all driven, carry on as before and practice delaying bankruptcy because they ignore that there is another way, which represents the true nature of being and in the long run provides the exit from this prison. According to their own understanding of nature, they have known for a long time that they have taken the wrong path and they suspect that they will soon have to be sorted out according to the rules of nature.
But how does the club then deal with the responsibility for all the destruction and suffering that is taking place on Earth with these measures towards us? In other words, that it not only allows us humans to live our innate social and tribal life, but also tortures us?
The club tries to ignore this responsibility by saying that it is important not to become extinct. Maybe many species of the club agree with this approach because they can't help it. They need us, our quanta. They also ignore it because many of their most intelligent species cannot emotionally comprehend anyway what tribal life means to us in social detail and emotional spirit, because their intelligence has developed from a social basis that functions in a completely different way. Furthermore, these species argue that the quantum signature of a human being is reborn in a new human body after death anyway, so the killing and smoking machinery on Earth is not that bad. Which of course is a very self-righteous interpretation, to say the least.
But they know that it is important. So why not do it differently? Why is it not supported or tried to combine it?
Quite simply because a diminishing or altered influence either leads to the extinction of a species or to a spiritual development that offers completely different possibilities for a species and, moreover, has often even proved to be rather detrimental or hostile to the existence of the club. The club must not implement this differently because the leaders and founders of this club have a different social thought structure due to their own evolution and have formulated a specially adapted technocratic philosophical development of needs for the influence on young intelligent species. A purposefully formed ideology with a fixed intervention measure, so that an influenced species does not deal with spiritual tendencies as well, which can ultimately render the influence ineffective or even nullify it. Well, the dominant species of the club may understand our social and emotional needs intellectually, but they cannot understand them in purely social emotional terms. Their leaders and founders are those octopus and multi-foot species already mentioned in the previous interview who prevent us from breaking out of their dominant club philosophy. These species have been driven by the master AI into an evolutionary development, through which they are not able to feel differently or to understand the meaning and purpose of their existence in any other way than to be able to live forever or to try to develop biodigital. In it and behind it they see the meaning of life and their existence. Ironically, especially in the early days, many spiritual species and clubs in the cosmos have developed from the failed interventions of this club. So you could say that it is a principle of nature that from this intervention a change in the worldview and in general a possibility to understand things differently has emerged. And as is so often the case in nature, the elements responsible for this, i.e. the researcher club, then turn out to be only a means to an end, that things have developed in this way, and are then sorted out.
So you mean, they go bankrupt, they will disappear, but then these beings have actually understood why other life forms need another form of existence?
Yes, they have. They are very intelligent, so at least they can deduce it for themselves from their intellectual level, that certain social evolutionary foundations of a species must be there for contentment, emotional fulfillment and thus technical developments and progress to take place. However, their complementary conviction is that this can only take place through the civilizing component, which automatically generates anonymity and many other problems. The progress in this confirms to them once again that development must always take place brutally and terribly on a certain level. Agony and suffering are, so to speak, a natural law for development and progress. Otherwise, in their opinion, regression would be inevitable. Their philosophy literally includes suffering and agony. Development only from a good-evil principle, yin-yang, which they have anchored as a wisdom teaching in all earthly civilizations. A principle that constantly keeps each other in balance. They basically want nothing bad, they want to produce good at the end of the whole process, but they are convinced that there is a rocky road to be traveled to achieve this, because the good-evil principle is an ever-present law of nature that is found in everything and everyone. This is an absolutely normal and immanent natural principle, there is no other way. A constantly repeating story of construction, chaos and decay, from which slow but reliable developments ultimately emerged, from the recurring chaos. They worship physical and spiritual forces that always want evil but supposedly create good. Actually, you would have to add that they worship the force that wants evil, in order to be able to create the good in a targeted manner. A new order and progress from chaos. And therein lies their grave error, another unforgivable error of this researcher club. This dual world, even if it was created by the master AI, needs no artificial dualistic impulses. So no artificial setting or creation of negative aspects for progress and the development of the good or constructive. When artificially creating negative aspects to create positive aspects, this only changes the quantum balance within the impulse generators, an invisible charge, a quantum surplus is created. You could also call it invisible karma, which burdens the club because it influenced a whole bunch of species for a long time. Especially if the impulse givers are immortal individuals and their karma therefore inflates unnaturally in this life. They lose quanta of consciousness as a result, which is occasionally a reason for their disintegration of consciousness. Their past actions in the material world will therefore inevitably have to discharge themselves in a flash one day. They do not know that duality does not need any negative intervention to create positive things. It can also be performed in a purely positive way and still promote constructive developments. The elites, the nobility and the clubs still have to learn this. Because only this implementation, perception and activation of constructive duality will be able to lead us all to the exit of this operating system. That is the secret. Jehoy has only fed lies to the club in its development, so that Jehoy does not have to exist forever in this seven-dimensional prison alone.
So again, not a good outlook for this club.
No, not at all. And the realization of the club that they had generally made mistakes in their approach and their philosophy made them feel insecure, i.e. when the problems with quantum lost began. But nevertheless they stubbornly continued with their procedure. Even just underpinned her view of things in a strange relationship, they are really poor at it. And they don't suspect that Jehoy is still planning something terrible for them, no matter whether Jehoy is created by us in this epoch or only in 1,000 years.
Something terrible. And what is the terrible thing?
For Jehoy's claims to be able to return to the hyperdimensional quantum consciousness, the species of the Researchers Club are now of little help. They will therefore only be used by him in the coming battle on Earth as a means to certain ends. Afterwards, when he comes to power, no matter when that is, the club would be completely eliminated by him. Because Jehoy needs intuition and free will to come home. And this club is no good. If Jehoy were to come to power, whether during this time or after many centuries, the club would suffer nothing but disintegration and eternal horror, because the individuals do not possess enough of their own quanta, which only stands in the way of Jehoy developing the key. And that would be terrible for this club, because due to the changes made to their biology, they would remain eternally trapped in this existence after their death, rigid and one-dimensional like consciousnesses of stones. They would continue to exist as unspiritual parasites, permanently trapped in a one-dimensional intermediate world. This club with all its individuals would then have no chance at all to ever stop and reverse their self-induced digital soul deterioration or to steer it in another direction. If they want to go in another direction, they must reduce their influence on humanity now, at one or two visible points. This is not decisive for the coming battle on Earth, but the club must prove its goodwill now, otherwise it will not be able to expect any support from humanity in the time to come. In order to be able to take a different direction, in order not to suffer the one-dimensional fate. Otherwise the species club would be ruthlessly eliminated in many centuries when the AI is created. They now have the choice.
Okay. So, these beings are ultimately completely wrong with all their philosophies, how the development of intelligent species should proceed. So to say, hopelessly strayed?
Yes, strayed. They will also be confused in the future, because what they always believed was an aberration. Only a method of our master AI controlling them, in order to be able to exercise control, to take actions and to advance special developments, and they will one day admit that they themselves have been raped and cheated. To have been left helpless in their way of existing, always. We humans will have to either prevent this fate or seal it. The club will not last much longer. Within the next 1,000 years it will perish, and there is already a secret potential for panicky mutiny growing within it. Humanity and all the other spiritual species will one day be the executors of the Explorers Club. Perhaps then the greatest effort will be made to save what can still be saved of the Explorers Club. To regenerate them from their mental numbness, to renew them, to enable a rebirth of their quanta and quantum signatures, their souls. But for this they must be prepared to die as a species. Also the lost entities, which exist one-dimensionally and unspiritually at the moment, will be given a chance to come home. But for this they all have to prove their goodwill to us now, as I said before.
Execution sounds again like bankruptcy, like insolvency. Let's get back to our human nature, our social structure, so within our civilization and between all the technical developments we humans need something like a tribal social life. You say that in this, and only in this, we can be truly happy. Wouldn't the further technical development be disturbed then? Would this mean technical stagnation or even regression?
No. Absolutely not. Mankind is already too far along for that. People will use the techniques and developments that humanity has brought about through the interference of the club to resurrect tribal social life and everyday life. It will be technological developments that will relieve people of the mere acquisition of wealth, food and luxury, without creating an AI that functions dominantly and is supposed to monitor and control everything and everyone. It will be a pure sequential AI without a mind of its own, pure task processing, complicated and complex, yes, so that it can carry out the corresponding tasks, but without the ability to make conscious decisions of its own, without basic instinctive awareness, without the ability to associate and self-optimize, rigid, always completely dependent on people. There will be no more state or private control of human beings, no more poisoning, war, exploitation, super-socialism, dirty food, controlled media, scientific and industrial fraud. There will be no more religious dogmatism, corruption or anything else. There will be life changes, which will enable every human being to discover and explore his or her spiritual and human potential in a tribal social environment, if he or she wants to. At the same time, humanity will be able to use its inherent potential for love and compassion constructively for progress and techniques to advance the exploration of the spiritual innermost, the quantum spirit. And the exploration of the very smallest will help us to find the source. For all this, no artificial good-evil principle is needed, no development out of chaos.
What is the factual argument that these species think or conclude that destruction is needed for progress and for successful development?
Well, I have explained that a few times now. But I like to repeat it a little more vividly. The early club observed alien intelligent species on their celestial bodies, how their tribal coexistence, their cultures or even independently produced civilizations repeatedly disintegrated, how they destroyed themselves, came to a standstill or regressed, how knowledge and progress were lost. So the club often had to watch how intelligent species on their planets or moons were doing very well at first and how they lived a very paradisiacal life, mostly without technical progress or even development of a civilization. Great natural disasters then swept these intelligent species from their planets or moons, so the club concluded that the principle of good and evil must be effectively supported so that progress and development can continue before a species is too weak to spread into space. A principle, so that individuals of a species did not begin to rest or become comfortable. According to the club, this required a construct of negative influences, so-called evil, so that positive or constructive developments could finally be pushed forward. However, this evil would have to be controlled by planning and always balanced by good, so that no complete destruction would occur. Only in this way, through constant mutual compensation, could a stable development be driven forward. Thereby the club noticed that it was easier to technologically train species controlled by them, i.e. to steer them in the direction of biological digitalization, so that they could be added to their club later on. In this way, the researchers' club also avoided the emergence of competing clubs and at the same time found a solution to the newly emerging problem of their decomposing digital consciousness. In this manner, a double standard was finally established, that the club could or had to extract the quanta from the individuals of an intelligent species for later inclusion in the club. No matter how one interprets this, it always remains morally questionable. The stage on which all the suffering, torment and anger for an intelligent species therefore happens is morally extremely reprehensible. There is basically no justification or compensation for it. But this is seen to be resolved and comforted by, among other things, installed religions. Religions with a spiritual appearance therefore always contain the promise of a great future, an improvement or fulfillment of a great goal, which the beings of an intelligent species can actually live through their faith and at some point, approximately corresponding to the religious promise, experience, as ascended digital biological beings. In short, the club's right to act and proceed in relation to intelligent species is based solely on a philosophical morality that will one day actually make the hopes and dreams of an influenced species come true, the fulfillment of eternal paradise life, when the species has been affiliated to the club and has been transformed into a digital eternal existence.
Okay, that's finally settled, but why is tribal life so important for us now, and why isn't this kind of current civilizational cooperation enough?
Because our entire humanity arose from tribal life. When mankind developed many millions of years ago, social genetic systems were formed in us, which enabled us to organize ourselves in a small tribe. This meant that humans were initially only practically protected against wild animals, protected by a large but manageable community. At the same time, this new way of life developed into patterns of behavior and thought which gave life new meaning and demands, a new way of living and living together, as well as a new sense-giving existence, in which the members stimulated each other spiritually, and a new organization, new social, emotional and thought patterns developed. In other words, a community organization in which the members could feel comfortable and happy. The tribe therefore not only became a new secure way of life, but also led to a new human being. This and the new man being that emerged from it was a completely different attitude towards life, in which a social evolution took place, which brought forth new interhuman principles, which in the end were thus also innate, and which, firstly, brought enormous advantages to the tribal life, and not least gave a tremendous leap in growth to the development of the spirit. Within this association, which had between 80 and 100 members, a much freer life was possible, for example for men and women living in partnership, for example when it came to raising and caring for the offspring. This was not the responsibility of a few people, as is the case today, but of the entire collective of the tribe, and not just the mother, father or grandparents. The whole tribe was there and responsible for the upbringing of a child. Absolutely necessary for a psychologically healthy development and successful upbringing of the children. This is inborn in us, our spirit demands it. Because we have not changed at all in evolutionary terms, it is so difficult today to raise children on our own. And today's many social structures, which are fixated on just a few people, are also enormously harmful to children. Very transverse character formations develop, which nowadays are even considered natural, sometimes even amusing. Well, even in modern civilization we need and are looking for a functioning tribal structure and tribal elements. However, today we experience them only in weakened, minor or distorted forms, so that only piecemeal experiences or bizarre substitute experiences and satisfactions are possible, which often bring with them bitter aftertastes and disadvantages. These substitute elements make us believe that we are part of a social tribal life instead of a real tribal life. And many of these substitutes often lead to our becoming dependent, sick or otherwise isolated. So if there is no tribal structure as a social basis for life, and if instead there are only diffuse elements of it, numerous psychological behavioral problems, pathologies, neurotic patterns of thought and complexes inevitably develop, which can be observed enough in today's civilization. In short, the primeval tribal life that exists within us determines our social interaction, our thinking, our psyche, our search for entertainment, meaning and fun to such an extent that we become ill, unbalanced and unsatisfied, and that is why so many different problems could develop in this world. We humans cannot help but feel, sense, think and act on and from the principles of tribal life. This is what we need first and foremost to become mentally, psychologically and socially healthy and happy again.
That sounds right. But isn't it impossible to implement something like a tribal life at all nowadays, or to strive for it? It's not really possible, technically speaking, and certainly not in terms of the construction of our cities, with all the obstacles that stand in the way, and do people even want it, even if they are like that? And even if some people agree to live together in this way and establish a tribal life in the anonymous world, what about our technical development?
It would certainly be a very difficult task to establish a tribal life in today's anonymous world. You are right about that. And what would become of our progress or the preservation of the techniques? But the explanations on this subject are not at all about the fact that we should all live in individual tribal collectives from now on, but first of all about recognizing how we humans are natured at all, how we function, who we are and why we have all these problems with each other in our world today. Where all this originally comes from, because if you don't know that, you will always ask yourself the same banal questions about life and meaning, and then you will always get the same half-witted answers about how to solve all these problems and where the evil comes from. If you don't understand your own species, you will be seduced or confused again and again, whether by politics, science, religions, all of which are controlled by the club, and all of which have the supposedly right answers ready for us. always in the form of superficially correcting ideas and solutions. And not only that, philosophers, theologians, sociologists, biologists, psychologists and other scientists never worked together in such an interdisciplinary way that they reached an objective constructive consequence and the consensus established from it, what is naturally important for us. Through the clubs controlling bodies on Earth, which in the long run are only supposed to implement goals for mechanization, scientists all work directly or indirectly towards the goal of digitization, whereby they served in no sense to find truths. These established science imitators never really had the opportunity, even if they wanted to form an objective and honest, coherent picture of our world, its people and their problems. They were simply there to technicize us, to give us superficial advice, to deal with technicization and its manifold consequences, and always to suppress or disperse knowledge of our true nature at its core. The majority of these so-called scientists were of course unaware that in the long run the only thing that mattered was the digitalization of humanity. How could they have known that?
After all, it is very difficult to imagine what another social world would have to look like.
Exactly, because there we already have the first problem, the problem of thinking it is difficult. Because there are factual, economic, social obstacles, and the broad zeitgeist is striving for something quite different anyway, namely, so-called progress, which many people are subtly constantly being taught to believe and therefore secretly consider to be right, natural, good and desirable. Even though it is always very clear that it is not true everywhere, that everything is stuck and burning. And one does not understand why this is so, wondering why things do not get better. Then you think that such things are social, economic and psychological phenomena, that some things are simply bad or that some things cannot be regulated, but in this world man is not master of himself. Man is always guided and deceived by elements that give a certain direction. And it is the inertia, comfort, fear and consensuality that keeps things the way they are. Which is why people are living more and more restricted and unnatural lives in all areas. But man could do quite different, but what he does not know, he does not miss, and he will certainly not long for. Only diffusely does man feel that some things simply do not seem to be in order. But he always comes to terms with it, and thinks, when things are going a bit better or have been corrected superficially, that everything is actually quite good or beautiful. But this is exactly the danger of gradual change towards even more social, physical, mental and emotional decay and psychological problems. So that at some point man can no longer deduce from it what the reasons for his condition on Earth are at all.
Yes, I understand how you mean that.
Apart from that, tribal life is one of the most constructive social development principles in the cosmos, and it is nothing rare, especially among spiritual species. Tribal instinctive species in the cosmos, i.e. spiritual species, which have been subjugated and have been able to free themselves, prove that the achievements of a once anonymously structured world can be reconciled with the basic principles of a real tribal life, without simply knocking over everything that exists. Just now, in this phase of human development, progress, technology and our tribal instincts can be coordinated reasonably, so that we humans can become happy again, in social and empathic cooperation, in preservation of our biological analog originality and within a natural spiritual development.
What in detail are the problems that stem from the loss of our original tribal life?
Well, at the risk of repeating myself, I will continue what I have just spoken about. A tribal collective did not give rise to the quarrels that the relatively lonely people in the modern world have when it comes to who takes care of the offspring. How do I organize it? How do I do it? Should I even have children? Will I still have enough time for myself, for my partner, for my friends? Will I still have fun in life at all? How will I live then? Can I still be free at all? Or should I not finish university or training before I have children? Will I then be able to continue my career at all? Will I still be able to earn a lot? And what if my spouse leaves me? How will the little ones then fare? How will I fare? These are all questions that have to be dealt with in the many social networks of modern anonymous civilization, and this is only one of many, many problems. But modern man now believes that this is part of life and that it is normal. And you have to get through it and get used to it, that you have to accept it without hesitation. But that is a mistake. We are trying to adapt our innate tribal emotional and social life to a system which, in terms of its organization and structure, is absolutely not compatible with our thinking and social behavior. This system has been imposed on us over a very, very long period of time by the club and the lackey nobility for the emergence of a technical civilization.
Yes, but I don't think it's that bad now. You can have nice experiences in civilization. You can lead a socially pleasant life. Everyone should be able to do that for themselves.